My name is Aaron Evans, and some time ago I was the reason that 20 people lost their lives. I'm writing this in part to confess to the world what I've done and to describe to everyone the horrific yet eye-opening experience that brought me to this point. Let me start by explaining some facts about myself. I live in New York City and I am the CEO of a massive company producing plastic bags, though I will not name it here. A couple of days ago, one of my factories producing high-density polyethylene suffered a horrid explosion, ripping apart a massive chunk of the building with eyewitness testimonies claiming to have seen the roof catapulted tens of feet into the air. The blinding light of the event lit up the city for miles. It took fire crews working all evening to get the blaze under control, and several of them, despite their training and equipment, were scorched with severe burns or were coughing out their lungs from smoke inhalation. The colossal pillar of black, billowing fumes was still visible the next day, dwarfing even the tallest skyscrapers. When all was said and done, 20 people were confirmed dead. 15 of them had died from the initial blast, and 5 others had died from causes such as lung damage, asphyxiation, or burns as they tried to escape the crumbling wreckage. But that wasn't the end of the drama. As luck would have it, atmospheric conditions of the day had prevented pollutants from escaping up into the atmosphere, instead spreading their dangerous and noxious gases around the city. We denied that there could have been any such toxins at first to save face, but we soon caved under further investigation brought upon by the fact that multiple people who were near the factory at the time reported smelling something bitter in the air, substantiated by the surviving workers complaining some days later about headaches and nausea. We eventually conceded that it was likely that the inferno released ample amounts of hydrogen cyanide, and that was enough to scare the city into ordering people within a few miles of the factory to stay in their homes until the fallout could escape. Obviously, there were many questions that followed about how such a problem even came to be, but we had assured the public that we had investigated ourselves and found nothing wrong. It was eventually deemed a tragic accident, caused by faulty wiring, the usual suspect. That was thanks to a fantastic PR team working diligently day and night to warp the narrative into whatever I saw fit. My name was clear and I got off without even a slap on the wrist. But make no mistake, it was my fault. Entirely. The story that we came up with wasn't entirely untrue. It was faulty wiring that caused the initial fire that led to the explosion. However, the wiring would have never been faulty or exposed or nearly as dangerously close to the flammable chemicals had I listened to the concerns of the people who worked under me. I've always been a stuck-up rich prick, raised in a wealthy family, got sent to an elite private school with people in my wealth class, and inherited my parents' business basically immediately upon graduation. I never really had to fight for anything. It was all handed to me, and that, combined with how I was raised, led me to see the less fortunate as well. Lazy. If you're wondering why I'm telling you all of this information that will, obviously make you hate me, well, there are 2 reasons. 1, I've since learned the hard lesson that most of what I believed back then is false. And 2, it's necessary to understand the type of person that I was. The factory workers have been trying desperately to unionize for years before the accident, and I fought them at every turn. Through successful propaganda, incessant delays, and the firing of most big advocates, I was always successful in busting them. Not only that, but they would frequently come to me with concerns. The place was outdated, to say the least. Old and rusty, and it was clear many of the machines there had never been replaced or renovated since my grandparents had owned the place. They barely even worked, and the rundown, decrepit nature was generating horrifying safety hazards left and right. But the machines were still running, so why should I have to fork over the extra cash to replace them? Now, all of what I'm saying may be confusing to you. I know very well that there are no recent news stories breaking of something remotely describing what had happened that night. And that's because, well, it never happened. I sense that this explanation leaves you with more questions than answers, so I guess that I should stop beating around the bush. It was a couple of weeks after the accident. I had just left my penthouse apartment and was going to my block's local subway station. While crossing the street to the stairs that I would use to get down to the platform, my eyes were glued to my phone, not even paying attention to the walking signal. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a car roared into my peripheral vision. I didn't even hear it until its horn screamed into my ears. The sound of its tires on the asphalt of the street, drowned out by my thoughts and the hustle and bustle of the morning city. My heart was shot with adrenaline as I leaped into the air, hearing the screech of rubber slipping on the rock behind me as I sailed and collided with the ground. I let out a half cry in agony as I slowly rolled over to my stomach. Once I had processed what had happened and finally stood up straight, a burning fire was lit inside me. "Hey!" I yelled, storming right up to the driver who was now running out of his car, the color now completely drained from his face. "Hey idiot, watch where you're going next time." He didn't respond. In fact, nothing about him changed. He just stared head on, his breath stuttering and hitching in several broken fragments. I rolled my eyes. I was running late. He hadn't actually hit me, so there was no need to get the police or insurance or any other party involved. And as much as I wanted to clobber this person for having nearly killed me in the street right then and there, I had more important things to attend to. And a couple of moments later, as I was scrolling through my phone waiting for my train to arrive, the incident was cleared from my mind entirely. "There is a downtown train approaching the station. Please stand away from the platform edge." I didn't hear the train number that was called. I didn't think too much of it at first, chalking it up to me being too distracted to pay full attention as I often am. This whole procedure is so routine that I hardly even acknowledge the automated arrival announcements anymore. All trains on this color line were going where I was anyway. But now looking back on it, this was weird. I had caught everything else perfectly, but when it came down to the number, I can't really explain, my brain just skipped over it. Something had been said clearly. I had registered that after the fact. It wasn't silence and it wasn't gibberish either. It was as if I just couldn't process it. Like the sound had reached my ears, but the second it made its way to my head, I just shut down. And any thought back to it just refused to compute. It's hard to put it into words unless you experience it. I boarded, putting so much autonomy into my step that I was almost a robot. And when I made it into the car, I finally looked up from my phone. And for the first time during this whole ordeal, I noticed that there was something off. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Ashes, smoke, and a slight hint of something else. It reminded me of a scorched piece of meat at first, a weird combination of burnt food. Their scents mixed together so perfectly that I couldn't tell one from the other. In addition, there was an odd, metallic scent, like that of a penny and a hint of sulfur. Even though there was only a suggestion of it, it was sickening. And I almost retched as I looked up to scan for the source. Only I found none. Everything was clean, immaculate even, as if somebody had just gone through and polished everything. There was only one other person here, a figure sitting in the far back corner near the door that exited to the outside coupling. He was crouched over on his seat, his entire body covered in a long gray, tattered cloak made of a rough, broken fabric with a hood that fell around his face, perfectly obscuring any skin. I at first thought that the scent was coming from him, but that couldn't be. It had no discernible direction or distance, as if it was coming from everywhere. That was about where I had it. No matter how late I was not about to risk my life by being alone here. I snapped back around, ready to gun it for the exit, when suddenly the door slammed shut in front of me. There was nothing to announce their closure, no beeps and no "stand clear of the closing doors, please." Instead, they blurred past my eyes with such an intense ferocity that I almost made me step back to avoid becoming crushed in the giant metal maw. I stared wide-eyed at the scene before me, a malfunction that I rationalized. It made sense then. I barely had time to think about it though, because soon the train roared to life. I almost fell onto my side, losing my balance as it jolted forward with a vengeance that I hadn't seen before. The windows blackened with the overbearing walls of the tunnel, the only light that remained being those from the overheads, which radiated their artificial glow across the entire area, as well as the occasional flare of a bulb from outside. I collected my bearings and took a deep sigh to calm my nerves. Relax, I told myself. You can get off at the next stop. With that in mind, I slowly wandered over to the nearest seat, keeping whoever that hooded man was in my sight the whole time. He hadn't moved since I first boarded. The violence of the train's acceleration held steady. It required consistent use of my upper body to keep myself upright. We had hit our expected top speed a while ago, and it kept going. The sound of singing wheels on the track grew louder, the carriages thundering through the echo of the void we were plundering into. My stomach dropped as I frantically looked around the car in a panic. The figure was still staring at the ground as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening, but for me it unnerved me to no end. Subways weren't supposed to go this fast. I began honestly believing that I might have been on a runaway train and that nothing would stop us. We were just going to keep plowing through the darkness until we eventually crashed. And that feeling, that idea of suddenly being confronted with my own mortality, trapped in a situation that I had no possibility of controlling, it sent the worst chills up my spine that I had ever encountered. I looked out the window, the flashes from outside having morphed into a single vibrating straight line as motion blurred the individual fixtures together. And I just sat there. It was all that I could do, listening to the thundering of the steel cars drowning out everything else as they rummaged through my eardrums, just waiting for the inevitable. But then we hit the brakes hard, all at once. I was immediately tossed from one side to the other. A violent, shrill screech erupted from below as the wheels ground to a halt. I breathed a sigh of relief and closed my eyes as I tilted my head towards the ceiling. We would come to a stop soon, and then I would finally be able to get off this thing. I didn't care about how late I was anymore, I just wanted out of here. Then I would run immediately to the MTA and give them a piece of my mind about the situation that they had put me in. Who knows, I probably would have checked for grounds to sue them, just to be sure. The void outside gave way to dim, yellowish light as we were pulled into a station. I jumped out of my seat and practically sprinted to the door, which opened almost immediately as we came to a complete stop. I practically burst from the train, determined to storm up to the next employee and give them a face full of what they had done. But those thoughts were put to rest almost immediately. Stepping onto the platform, I was assaulted with a tidal wave of warm, heavy, and sticky air. This wasn't too weird, but the smell was a little bit odd, wet and earthy. Definitely better than what I had encountered on the train, but noticeable. Just a single look at the yellowish walls immediately pinned a culprit. Black spots dotted throughout almost every corner, crevice, and tile, spreading and expanding their influence like an infestation. Mold. The place was covered in it. The walls were also falling apart, covered in shades and strings of brown, green, and other unsightly colors, drooping down their entire length as if they were melting. And the text signaling the name of the station. It had been corroded to such an extent that it had become unreadable. This may have been a bit more concerning to anyone else living in any other city around the world. However, any New Yorker will know that these sights are unfortunately commonplace, and I dismissed this as being a station that I usually skipped on the express. The door slammed shut behind me, and just like that, the train took off, the smoke of the violent braking still trailing behind it, and I was left alone. The other guy had not followed me out. I was still shaken up by what had happened, and being alone on a rundown, decrepit subway platform wasn't helping either. So I just decided to walk until I found something to reorient myself. A dark pit within me began to fester as I observed my surroundings. There were no maps, no directional signs, nothing that could point me to an exit or at least tell me where I was. I was trapped within an endless maze of corridors with no sense or reason, just yellow tiled walls. The lights above me were flickering, barely holding on to their exhausted bulbs that struggled to put forth their radiance. At this time, I was starting to have serious doubts about my situation. I didn't fully register the scale of what was happening yet, but the environment that I found myself in was enough to put anyone off. The soundscape dominated by nothing but an echo of dripping water far off somewhere in the distance that morphed into a hideous whispering as it bounced off the corridors. This would be a perfect place to be stabbed. I could only think about it for so long, however, before the flashes from above increased in intensity, and the buzzing turned to far more of a crackling, static sound. Not a second later, hundreds of loud pops tore their way through the building. My eyes were hit with a blinding white for a microsecond before I became engulfed in sheer, absolute darkness. I stilled, my heart thundering in my chest as I tried to look around and find some way to orient myself. But there was nothing to feed my starved eyes. I was stuck here, standing in an endless expanse, unable to see myself or any part of my body. Was I supposed to wait here until somebody found me, or stumble aimlessly like a lost soul searching for salvation? And that was when I felt it. A calm wind lightly feeling its way down the back of my neck, sending my hair straight on end, accompanied by something that I couldn't quite describe. A lingering presence pushing down on me from behind. The breeze moved slightly to the left, leaving my neck entirely. The sound that I heard was barely discernible. A slight crackling started from behind me and slowly reached toward my ear, almost like the pop of bubble wrap, but a lot more unnatural, fleshy. I wanted to run, but I was locked in place and I resorted to shaking uncontrollably. My breast came out ragged and hitched, trying to keep in the tears. And then there was the groaning. Guttural, labored, broken to pieces, charred, as if trying to make a noise, but all that came out was a remnant of what once was. It filled my ears, working through the tubes like a parasite, joining in with the cool air, caressing my hair slightly as it drifted across my skin. And with that, I finally snapped out of it. I busted into a full sprint, not even caring where I was going. I just needed to get away. The smell of smoke came back with a punch that I wasn't prepared for. It pierced through my nose, that sharp stench that combined itself with a hint of bitterness. I coughed, first a little bit and then again and again before I finally stood still, bending forward before letting myself succumb to an attack. I would know that chemical smell anywhere. It had been all over the streets since the accident. Finally up ahead, a small sliver of light. I unsteadily shook my way towards it, fighting out the last of my respiratory system's wear. It was a dim, shaky glow flooded with an inferno's deep, warm orange. But there was no flame. I watched as the shadows of the invisible pyre danced along the walls to the tune of an unfeelable draft. In the brightest part, sitting with her back leaned against the wall, was what appeared to be a woman. She was draped in a worn, tattered white dress, long since stained with splotches of gray that grew like an infection to cover the fabric. Her head was on her knees that were hugged closely to her chest. Long, crooked silver hair was draped haphazardly around her legs, barely concealing the small crusted paper in her hands. She was rocking slightly, her mouth letting out shattered breaths. The motion allowed the parchment to briefly peek out of its confinement. A small square with white borders surrounding something in the middle. A photo. Of what I couldn't tell, it was too dark to make anything of it. I stepped backward, a broken tile crunched underneath my feet, and the woman stopped. I bolted as my survival instincts kicked in. Whatever was taking place, I didn't want a part of it. The woman's wailing got louder, echoing through the halls behind me. It was far more sustained now, no longer the pathetic broken excuse that it once was. I could hear it as it quickly overpowered everything in the station. The absolute strength of raw emotion, the grief, the loss. The fiery glow surged ahead and colored the entire corridor, the dancing shadows having transformed into long tendrils that wrapped themselves around me, threatening to jump out and pull me into whatever nightmare that this had become. Turn after turn, bend after bend, I prayed for an exit, for another person, for anyone that I could talk to, and just some form of release. The lights flickered back on, and I now found myself back at the train platform. I don't know how, I was more concerned with what was lying on the tracks. I had never been more happy to see those silver snakes. Salvation. I bolted in through the open doors of the subway train, only catching my breath as they forcefully slammed themselves shut behind me. After calming slightly, I picked one of the nearby seats and began walking towards it. But then I saw something out of the corner of my eye, causing my blood to chill to ice. Sitting at the far end of the car was the cloaked old man, the same one that I had seen on my first ride, with all the same posture. We lurched forward, accelerating with a force that I was all too familiar with. I was on the same train. My heart thumped harder and harder as I stared them down. I desperately tried to forge some form of rationalization, no matter how far-fetched, but I came up with nothing. Nothing could explain the vast series of coincidences that I was experiencing. I wanted to yell, shout at whoever was sitting bent over at the end of the train car, and demand to know what was happening. But a sound never escaped my lips. Instead, with a glimmering hand and in a last-ditch attempt to save myself, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and without breaking eye contact with the only other person here, I slowly dialed a 911. The roar of the train made the phone difficult to hear even on speakerphone, but I was a little relieved at the low tones that indicated ringing. 911, what's your emergency? The operator picked up almost immediately. The wheels were so loud at this point that I nearly had to shout to stay audible. Hi, yes, my name is Aaron Evans and I'm on a subway train headed. Hello, can you hear us? A third voice joined in and I stopped. Please, we need help. I can hear you, the operator said. What's going on? We're at the factory in Lower Manhattan. Please. The person on the phone began coughing violently and I could hear what seemed to be the sound of people yelling in the background, some with words and others just screaming in pain. We need help. There's been a massive explosion. The power's out and a whole section of the building's caved in. I'm trapped. Another series of violent coughing as a blanket of static came through the call. Sir, the firefighters are on their way. Just stay in the line for me, okay? Please. The voice was weak now, barely able to cut through the extreme hacking. The fire's getting closer. Oh God. Whoever was on the phone erupted into tortured shrieks as growling flames overtook the line. I was unable to move or form a coherent response. His wails broke, morphing into a series of hoarse and rough moans. A deep guttural sound as the blaze ruptured his vocal cords. Sir, are you still there? She was met with a series of 3 low-pitched beeps. Suddenly, I felt a burning, blistering pain drill its way through my right hand, radiating across my palm and extending to my fingers faster than I could react. I dropped my phone in shock and howled in agony as I clutched my right hand with my left. The phone smashed into the floor and I stared as white smoke poured from its destroyed screen. I looked up. The figure was still sitting there in the corner, having not moved, and now I had more reason than ever not to engage. The strange occurrences could no longer be explained away. This was when I truly came to terms with the fact that this was something greater than me, and the best that I could do was try not to provoke whatever was causing this any further. Was that audio real? I didn't even know the person on the phone. Looking at it from a distance, they're just all statistics to you. Numbers to write down on a clipboard for insurance or legal cases. I had never been so up close and personal with the victims before, never heard their voices, and hearing for the first time what was going on in that factory while the fires raged, I couldn't help but imagine myself in their shoes. What thoughts would be running through my head? Would I be able to handle the pain that this individual had experienced in his last moments? I shook myself out of it as I heard the brakes beneath the car. We emerged again, but not into a station like we had before. Everything outside was still as dark as the tunnel that we had just shot out of. Even as the doors opened, I saw nothing, just the elevated tracks that we were positioned on. I backed up slowly for obvious reasons and not wanting to be anywhere near the edge, but it appeared that I didn't have a choice in the matter because, just as I had reached my seat, a loud explosion tore up the space behind me. I was tossed forward as the train tilted vigorously on its side from the forest, sending me sailing through the car and out the door. I spastically flailed my arms out in all directions in a panicked attempt to break my fall. And then I landed, and I swear that I felt the bones of my forearms snap and ram themselves up through my elbow as my hands impacted the metal floor. I threw up from the shock of the pain as I rolled continuously, the world becoming a massive blur to me. Once I came to a stop, I lay on my back, staring at the tall, rust-colored ceiling, trying to catch my breath. My arms, as well as the rest of my body, were still throbbing. I dared to slowly turn my head over to my limbs as I desperately tried to hold in more bile from working its way up from my stomach. But they seemed fine. They didn't even look broken. But that couldn't be. I swore that I heard those bones shatter. I felt that forearm ram itself out of my skin. But I saw none of that. In fact, I could move both arms just fine. They still hurt like hell, but even that was beginning to wear off now. I stood up weakly, still dazed at what had just occurred and how I just seemed to be okay after a horrid fall like that. And that's when I heard the roar of a wall of flames erupting from behind me with renewed strength. My head snapped back at what had been released. Sheets of track, jagged and crooked, twisted and shooting off in different directions like a shattered corpse. They came tumbling down from the above supports. The inferno raged as it ripped side to side, front to back, as if carried by some invisible draft. It shot forwards towards me, the blistering heat submerging my face as it enveloped what was left of the thick and rusted railing. The blaze began to swirl, shooting up towards the ceiling and capturing the decayed infrastructure in its violent grasp. The smell of smoke attracted my nostrils, as I was blasted from my side with a burning wind so intense that I had to make a serious effort to ground myself to keep from falling. And then, with one final whoosh, it disappeared from the ground up, leaving nothing behind. A new eerie silence crept over me as I was left alone in the overwhelming darkness, broken only by the occasional groans of what sounded like some unseen heavy metal settling or colliding with something off in the distance, echoing throughout the entire hall. I didn't dare myself to move. I crossed my arms close to my chest and looked around, but I couldn't see anything now. I knew that I wasn't going to make any progress simply standing here until I starved, and so I made the only choice that I could have. I picked a direction and I started walking, choosing to just continue forward, listening to the low howls of what appeared to be wind as it blew through the empty factory. A couple of minutes passed and then I heard something. It was far in the distance and barely audible at first. A few rhythmic taps that sounded above the ambience. I stopped, and so did it. However, when I kept moving, it resumed, melting with the sound of my feet. I stopped and listened again. I initially thought it was just the drip of water, but no, it wasn't that. Water doesn't just stop and resume on a dime. It doesn't sound this unnatural. I must have spun around multiple times, trying to pinpoint what I had heard while trying to make sure not to lose my orientation. It didn't make itself audible again, however, not until I prepared to begin walking again. And that's when I heard it louder than ever. It was a distinct, rapid slapping sound as if something soft, smooth, and wet were impacting the metal floor beneath it quickly over and over again. The sound of bare footsteps racing towards me. I leaped into action, sprinting with all my might, my lungs crying out in agony, but I ignored them. Those feet were gaining on me, belonging to a body that I could not and did not want to see. In the distance, a bright white light emerged that scorched my unadjusted eyes. I had to dart my head toward the floor to stop it from tearing through my retinas. A loud snap resounded ahead of me, and I watched as the glow became blocked by sheets of jagged metal supports and insulation that burned with a crackling fire, raining down from the ceiling. I stopped and held my ears shut as they let loose a high-pitched shriek upon scraping into the floor. When I looked up, I saw my path forward entirely walled off with burning rubble and ruin. It circled me, providing no way out, all except for one small hole directly in front. It was nowhere near big enough to walk through from where I stood. I debated if I could even crawl my way to the other side. There was no choice but to try. However, whatever was following me, seemingly now aware of my predicament, had picked up its pace. I practically dove into the hole, the exposed spikes and pieces of rusty metal tearing into my skin as I weaved into the enclosure. I forced my way through despite the pain. The material around me closed in far too tight for me to crawl, causing me to extend my arms out ahead of me and scooch forward, using exposed pieces of the ceiling, which were now jutting out of the floor as leverage to push off with my feet. It felt like the entire place climbed about 10 degrees in the span of a couple seconds. I could feel my face going red as sweat poured out of every pore in my body, my clothes sticking to my skin as they were wrenched in between the walls, squeezing me down from all sides. My lungs were crushed, forced into a deep compression that they would never expand from. Inhaling was painful, and every time I managed to, all I could draw in was a weak puff of blazing air that seared my throat as it forced its way down, raising the sweltering heat even more. The light seemed so close that I just had to keep moving, but it became more of a struggle the further I got. The progress that I was making was becoming less and less, a law of diminishing returns so harsh that it would ensure that I never made it to my destination. I was opening new gashes on my arms and my legs left and right, and I could feel the blood draining from my body. Suddenly, everything around me shifted, and the ceiling caved in, the last millimeter or so that it had, locking me down completely. I began to panic as I desperately attempted to inch forward. I put all my weight into my feet and pushed off, trying to drag myself with my hands. But no matter how much strength or force I put into the movements, I was stuck. I became more spastic, desperate. I was losing breath with each inhale that I tried. "Please," I heard a faint whisper coming from somewhere behind me. It was pained and desperate, as if using its last breath to beg for help. "The fire's getting closer. Oh God." I jumped, crashing my head into the ceiling, my vision growing blurry as I felt the crimson begin to flow down my face. Something had brushed my leg. It came again, this time slowly sliding down the limb's length. Its texture was rough and flaking, the failing sheet of skin that I could feel even through the fabric of my pants. A finger, multiple of them. I yelped as the hand clamped down on my lower calf. I shook my limbs fiercely, trying to get it off me, trying to break free, but it held on unrelentingly. "Please, we need help." The debris shifted again, and I heard the distinct sound of bone cracking as it let go. A shriek of suffering filled the tunnel as I finally broke free, pulling myself desperately, making progress inch by inch until finally, the light had fully enveloped me, and I fell forward, colliding with the ground and tumbling only a few moments later. I got up on my hands and knees, breathing heavily on the very familiar dark and rubber flooring. I stopped, slowly turning toward these seats that lined the walls as the roar of wheels speeding down the metal track filled my ears. I stood up immediately, rubbing different areas of my body and checking myself for injuries. There was nothing. As always, the hooded figure sat at the far end of the car. However, this time his head, while still obscured by his cloak, was slightly tilted towards me as if he was watching me with a peculiar interest. And I just couldn't hold it back anymore. A surge of anger bubbled up from deep below and I yelled. "What?" I demanded. "What do you want from me?" Tears began streaming from my eyes. I knew that provoking this person probably wouldn't end well for me. But at this point, I had come to terms with the fact that I was never getting out of this situation anyway. And if nothing else, I at least wanted answers. What was happening? Why me? The cloaked figure didn't respond at first, but soon I saw his chest begin to heave up and down. It was convulsive, jerky, snapping between the two positions incessantly. It grew in intensity as the head began to drift up and down. Finally, I heard what appeared to be small breaths escaping his lips. They immediately cut to sharp inhales before I heard the tone of his vocals. Deep, parched, dry, cracking laughter. It started gently at first before intensifying and harmonizing with the clicking of the wheels. We exited the tunnel and found ourselves above ground for the first time since all of this had begun. I turned and stared out the windows of the door. The sky was blanketed with a layer of light gray clouds. The sound of rain sheets pelting the train's metal exterior formed a symphony with the thunder and lightning that struck through the skies above. We appeared to be in the middle of nowhere. Nothing but trees and a washed-out, lifeless expanse. The train bit the brakes again. The figure laughed hysterically as we descended to a halt, where the growth finally led up into a broad clearing. I stared wide-eyed as the doors in front of me opened. Outside lay a field of 20 graves, all already covered up and filled in except for one. Surrounding the forwardmost center was a group of people, their faces obscured with black. They each held a candle with a flame that appeared purely white in the washed-out color grading, unaffected by the rain dropping from the skies above. They didn't even notice me, never turning their heads and never distracted from what they had lost. A coffin was being lowered into the ground. I tried my hardest to look at who was being buried, but the name, it was indecipherable. I couldn't even begin to make out the text scrawled on the rock. Another nameless individual. The train doors slammed shut and I turned around and jumped at seeing the hooded one now standing just a few inches behind me. I don't know when he moved, but now he was right here. His hood had been completely removed, revealing a wrinkly, dark and dirty burnt face. Loose strands of silver hair wavered off the top of his head in threads, barely holding on for dear life. And his smile, oh God, his smile. Bleeding, cracked lips with yellow teeth. A curve that stretched all the way to the bottom of his eyes. Eyes that contained nothing but pure, unfiltered blackness. He tilted his head to the side and I heard the popping of muscle and the cracking of old flesh as he did so. And then he slowly moved one shaky hand upwards, pointing at something behind me. I turned around and saw what he had wanted me to see. Above my head was a list of stops. I scanned through each one by one, and recognized them immediately. My local subway station at that first stop, all the way to now, and finally coming up next. End of the line. My stomach dropped and the train seemed to pick up speed as we rushed into the dark walls of another tube. I shook my head at the tears rolling out of my eyes. As I turned around, the old man began laughing again. He was beyond hysterical, and I could only watch, desperation contorting my face as he began to shake violently, streams of blood draining from his eyes. This was all my fault. I could see that now. It had been abundantly evident this entire time, but now at the very end, I finally saw it for myself. And so I did the only thing that I could do. I got on my knees, crying and begging. I apologized profusely for everything that I had caused and done, and surprisingly, I meant it. I wrung my hands together, closed my eyes, and I begged for forgiveness. I didn't expect to be heard, but I wanted him to know that I regretted everything, that I knew I deserved what was coming, and to make it clear that I would be better if I had the chance to do it all over again. And then out of nowhere, we came to a violent stop. The jolt knocked me over onto the floor. I was forced to open my eyes as I extended my hands forward to catch myself. I looked around, shaking. The old man was gone and the car was full. People were everywhere, lounging on seats, distracted on their phones or standing around holding the handrails, going about their daily business as if nothing had happened. A lot of them were staring at me, looks of confusion imprinted into their faces as if I was some sort of alien. I stood up unsure of my surroundings, and I practically leaped out of my skin when the doors opened behind me. I turned around and was greeted by a crowded platform as people from inside the train impatiently squeezed past me to get out. It was a stop that I knew very well, my home station. I timidly stepped out onto the yellow line and observed what looked to be typical rush hour traffic. My hand found my pocket and I felt something rectangular. My phone. I immediately pulled it out, revealing the pristine, undamaged touchscreen. I turned it on and the display came to life. I nearly yelped when I discovered what was written on the top. Sunday, May 11th, 8:03. 3 days before the explosion. I brought my hand to my mouth and began to laugh. I don't know why, I don't see how, but somehow, I had been given precisely what I had asked for. I bolted out of the station and made a series of phone calls as soon as I had reached my apartment. I ordered the factory to be closed temporarily and to put all employees on paid leave. At the same time, we brought in investigative and maintenance crews to go through the entire facility, update the equipment, and bring it up to safety standards. I must have spent millions and millions, but I didn't care anymore. It needed to be done. The factory is still closed, and I don't know how long it will be until it reopens. It depends entirely on how long everything takes. It's a big job, a lot of stuff that was left to rot for years, and it's finally getting replaced. I'm losing money each day as I need to continue to pay my workers, but it doesn't bother me. I have the funds to do it, and preventing the disaster that happened before is far more critical. I had a conversation with a union leader the other day. He was surprised by my sudden change of heart. I can't be the person that I once was, not anymore. The maintenance workers found the loose electrical wiring that had sparked and set off the chemicals. The press described it as a close call that was narrowly avoided. I'm being hailed as a hero now. But we all know that's not true. We all know what it took for me to change. The memory of it, of what I did, it still lingers in my head at night. It haunts me when I go to bed. And that's the point. I will need that eternal reminder to keep me on straight and narrow and show me what could happen if I ever turn on my promise. Speaking of which, I want to say one more thing before I part ways with you. I can see it now. The train, I mean. I saw it for the first time again while walking to the metro on May 12th. I was scared at first. I didn't understand what it was doing here. I was doing everything right, wasn't I? Why had it come back for me so soon? And then I realized it wasn't here for me. I saw that clearly as I watched someone else, a burly guy in his 40s, board the train before me, locked into his phone just like I was. I could only look on and half pity as the door slammed shut behind me, and he finally looked up in surprise. The train pulled out of the station with the strength that I had now grown used to, and I watched through the windows as the cloaked man sitting in his typical seat passed by me. And I swear that he was looking back at me, smiling.
David McCory, Ray, Country Allen, Nelson Asada.